Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. Hendrina, it was lovely to share a stage with you. And certainly congratulations to all of the participants in this program over the last several weeks. So I am hopefully now sharing my screen. If you can just confirm that you can see that. Okay, so following on from what Tim had said, I wanted to chat a little bit about the potential role of MFIs, multilateral financial institutions, also known as development banks, in developing Africa's space economy. And I want to start by saying that this is a really interesting time to ask this question, because we're moving from a point in the space industry where the dominant consumer of space services is the public sector, and moving towards one in which the private sector is playing an increasingly important role, not just in the development of technologies, but also in the consumption thereof. And so this kind of transition towards what some of my colleagues at Oxford are talking about as like space 4.0 is really this shift, also called like old space versus new space, but is looking at this change. And one of the why the MFIs are interesting is because when you have this shift towards the private sector, your development banks often play a really important role in actually helping to finance and capitalize these different questions or these different kind of programs. So I'll kind of share some of these thoughts, but really hope for some difficult questions at the end. So maybe just a few things that I wanted to cover today, just kind of at a very high level, talking about some of the important space industry. I'm sure we all know it, and you'll have touched on this over the last earlier in your careers, but a couple of things that I want to sort of just highlight. A little bit about some of the African multilateral financial institutions, and also some of the other ones that are beyond Africa, but that operate within the continent. What's happening within the African space industry, very briefly, and then starting to understand what is the actual roles that the different MFIs can play in developing the sector. And within that, there are, a few key areas. So thinking about things like funding and investment, technical support, capacity building, helping to establish relationships and stronger partnerships between governments and different organizations, helping to provide policy and regulatory support to governments, and then lastly, of course, in actual infrastructure development. There are a few case studies, not as many as we would like at this stage, but we're really in the early stage of this journey. And then I'll close out with a couple of challenges and opportunities, and what I see for the future. So why is the space industry kind of important for us? So one of the big changes that we've seen is the dramatic decline in cost of putting technology and systems into space. And what that has meant is that we are now able to establish a number of different platforms, sensors, communication systems, in ways that dramatically reduce the alternative costs here on Earth. So a good example of this that is kind of being scaled out and is discussed actively across Africa is Starlink, which is data services to remote areas in ways that would be prohibitively expensive if you had to lay fiber cable to all these different locations. But it's not just in terms of communications. There's applications within certainly Earth observation and remote sensing related to agriculture, carbon trading, responding to sort of environmental issues, all of which are far more efficient done from space than they are in situ. Of course, you always need to connect these, but space is a real kind of value multiplier for this. Now, the reason why this is kind of such a critical aspect is that, and this is kind of one of the advantages that we have as Africa, because we don't have a lot of existing infrastructure, we are able to leapfrog, right? And so, the idea of Africa sort of technological leapfrogging has, had a lot of traction over the last several decades, and it's true in multiple different sectors. And space is, in fact, one of these particular areas. So using space is another potential industry and sector for Africa to really leapfrog other kind of countries and build really advanced industries and sectors. And in doing that, of course, that helps to create a lot of high-skilled people across the continent. It creates opportunities that, at this stage, we're not necessarily aware of, but it is a mechanism for us to open up an entire new sector as opposed to replace one. And as we move through this whole industrial transformation, it's critical that this transition to a new kind of digital economy is not done at the expense of older economies. And so there's a just component to this. And because space is not significant at this point in Africa, we're able to grow something as opposed to replace something. So this is, I think, for me, a really, really important kind of idea to keep in mind. So, at a very high level, this is kind of like some of the reasons why I think the space sector itself is important. And just for those who may not have, had a lot of exposure to this, I just want to touch very briefly on what is, multilateral financial institutions, what are development banks. Hendrina had mentioned some of this before. For me, if I kind of summarize this, it's that these are banks whose objective is to address fundamental development outcomes in the regions within which they operate, and they are collectively owned by governments and other development banks. So, while a commercial bank would be listed on a particular stock exchange and is in the hands of kind of private investors, development banks are very often owned by governments. And their objective is to invest into the kind of projects that will enhance both the potential economic and socioeconomic growth of a region, as well as close the gap between real and the potential growth. And they do this through, providing a number of different financial products. So, excuse me, loans, grants, equity investments, all of the sort of traditional commercial bank instruments that would be used. But they also often provide technical assistance to help the investments that they make be more successful. And I think these are some important differences between what development institutions do and normal commercial banks. So these banks have been around for a very long time. They really emerged in kind of like during the last stages of World War II, around 1944, which is when organizations like the World Bank were established, International Monetary Fund. But in Africa, if I'm not mistaken, I think the African Development Bank was established in about 1963 or 1965. The Development Bank of Southern Africa was established in 1983. So these organizations have been around for, 50, 60 years at least, and really have done tremendous amounts of work in helping to finance the kind of development of the region. There are newer locally owned development banks. One of the important ones is something called the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank, that's owned through the BRICS Consortium, of which a number of African countries are members now. There are also a number of global banks that operate locally. So the World Bank, of course, is one. Another important one is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. which is traditionally operated in North Africa, but is also moving into the sub-Saharan African region in the next couple of years. So a lot of these different entities are here, and fundamentally they, provide financial services to governments and larger organizations to implement various different projects. So that all being said, what's happening at the moment in the African space industry? So, as Hendrina had mentioned, and as I'm sure that you're aware of, there's been a dramatic rise in the interest in space across the continent. Over the last 15 years, we've seen the development of more than a dozen space agencies, the launch of multiple satellites. I think it was 2 weeks ago that Senegal just launched their new satellite. So we're really seeing active involvement in this. But we still represent a really small portion of the global space kind of economy. So at the moment, the space economy is worth on the order of about $500 billion. The African space economy is on the order of about 20. So we're somewhere around 3 to 4% of the global space economy. But where can that go to? That's kind of really one of the things that we're seeing, and this is, I think, driving some of the interest from various governments about playing within the space sector. So, how is it that that MFIs can operate and work within and support the growth of the space sector? So I want to look at this across maybe 5 key areas, right? So the first is around funding and investment and providing support for space-related projects. The second is around technical support and capacity building. So this is helping the human capital aspects of the space sector. The third is around partnerships and collaborations and enabling regional activities to take place. The fourth is around policy and regulatory support. And then the last is around actual infrastructure development. So each of these different things is critical to build a kind of very dynamic space industry. So the first is around funding and investment. And so this is where there are opportunities to directly fund the establishment of space-related projects. So this image here is actually something called Intelsat 28, which was launched in 2011. It was also known as the New Dawn satellite, and it was an African communication satellite that was put into position into geostationary orbit above kind of Tanzania, 15 years ago now. And this was in part funded by the AFTB. So there was, a clear effort to invest into satellite infrastructure to offset the very, very high costs of, local data provided by fiber or copper or whatever the case may be. So there are a number of these different examples about where an individual country or even kind of large companies do not have the resources to put this infrastructure into space. And, development banks can then play a very important role in enabling that to happen. Now, you could ask, why wouldn't a normal commercial bank provide this? I think part of the challenge is that commercial banks, firstly, don't understand the space sector very well, and they tend to have higher kind of rather lower risk appetites because they have shareholder kind of issue that they need responsibilities through to their kind of publicly listed shares. Whereas development banks are designed to help create catalytic infrastructure like this. Um, this may not, be done by itself. So often you end up crowding in infrastructure, or crowding in investments from a number of other banks, but they act as the sort of like an anchor investor into these bigger programs. It's not just funding into infrastructure programs. A number of the development banks, and it had been mentioned earlier that there's like an entrepreneur focus being done. So, many of the larger development banks will invest into, for example, venture capital funds, or supporting research and development programs. So this is where they are, again, creating the underlying, in this case, knowledge capital. So we're talking about like some sort of satellite infrastructure, which is kind of like hard capital. But there's also investment into knowledge capital and entrepreneurial capital, that also yield this catalytic outcome. So the direct provision of funding, I think, is a really important element, that the development banks can and kind of do play an important role in. The second area is around technical support and capacity building. So one of the really important differences that most MFIs undertake is that when they invest into projects, they will provide what is called technical support, but it's basically advisory services and advisory support to their investees to get those projects successfully completed. Now, that could be, at the government level, if this is a public project. It could be at the private level, if this is run by a consortium of companies, but really enabling them as part of their investment into the project to actually ensure that the project is done successfully. And given that the development banks and the MFIs have significant human capital and access to these resources, organizations may not have the necessary expertise to do the entire kind of turnkey implementation. Very often, the people who are putting satellites into space are remarkable engineers, but don't always have the other elements of the kind of value creation process, whether it's on the business side or something like that. So this is where I think a really important element of development banks is that they can provide that additional capacity building process and really establishing the next layer of kind of space professionals in future. There's another really important element here, which is that when we think about capacity building, importantly, it is not just at an engineering level. When we think, often when we think about the space industry, we think engineers, scientists, putting satellites in space, or people on the downstream side, so remote sensing specialists, utilizing this. But the space industry requires lawyers, right? It requires people who understand policy and can, craft appropriate, space policy and strategy. It requires human resource professionals who understand how to place the right professionals in space sector. It requires and the nature of what a space-related project looks like. For example, how do you manage insurance for your space-based assets? How do you finance them? What is your payback periods? So just as you would have, financial professionals in the marine sector or mining or automotive, we also need those professionals who understand space. And so this for me is one of the really important things that I think is often overlooked, that we don't have, there's a lot of focus on creating engineers. And of course, you can't have a space sector without, absolutely kind of world-class engineering. But you also need all of these other skills in place to ensure that you have a coherent space economy. And so, going beyond just the engineering, I think, is an important aspect that can be looked at. The next element is around facilitating partnerships. So one of the the kind of advantages that most MFIs have is that they are collectively owned by multiple governments. And so if you think of like the AFDB, it's not just one country, but many countries across the region and internationally who have investors into that. So their ability to bring together key players across the region is really kind of unique. And this is certainly something that needs to be done from an African perspective in order for us to take advantage of things like the African Free Trade Agreement, but also because you don't want the services from like a satellite platform to only be applicable or available in a single country. You want to be able to deliver it across an entire region. And so being able to bring together all of these different players is a really powerful kind of value addition that the MFIs are able to play in this role. The next is around policy and regulatory support. So, there are genuinely few people across the continent who have deep expertise in building out and developing appropriate space policy. And, if you were to pick a random country in Africa, they probably do not have significant depth of experience in the development of such policy. Now, there are some remarkable policy, regulation, and legal scholars and advisors across the continent. The question is, how do you get them to be able to operate across the entire continent effectively? And how do you share knowledge between these different countries, agencies, and so on? And I think here again, this is a unique role that the development banks can play because they have the national treasuries, the central banks of many of these different countries, and they're able to establish essentially a kind of policy advisory system in combination with groups such as ASLI that really have the makers across the continent. So for me, this is a really important element that needs to be thought through. The last element to talk about for me in terms of the role that MFIs play, we've spoken about kind of like funding of larger kind of satellite constellations and so on, or kind of investment into entrepreneurial development programs. But in order for the space sector to operate effectively, you also need hard infrastructure on Earth. And there are a number of these different types of infrastructure that we need to think about. There are limited ground stations that exist across Africa, and this constrains the speed with which we can pull data down from a satellite onto Earth. And very often our data is drawn down in Europe or the US and then transferred across to us. And that kind of slows the entire process down. So building out the ground infrastructure, which is critical for satellite comms, tracking, geodesy, all of those elements is an important gap in our infrastructure system across Africa. A second important gap is the actual technical laboratories to build satellites and test them. Egypt is recently, but if you have to construct a satellite and ship it somewhere else to be tested and then brought back, these create all sorts of additional costs and incur time delays, all sorts of challenges. So there is an R&D infrastructure that is currently lacking. And so through working with universities and so on, there's an opportunity to address this particular gap. Linked to this is around things like data centers. We've seen the establishment of new data centers in kind of key regions across the continent, but satellites generate petabytes of information. And if we have to store all of that information outside the borders of Africa, it means that it takes additional time to access it. There's much higher storage costs. While Africa has low costs of land, relatively low costs for utilities like water and power, which kind of drive data centers. Our power also tends to be cleaner in many instances. So this is another layer of infrastructure that Africa can establish, and not just serve Africa, but indeed for the rest of the continent. And then, of course, there's a question around launch facilities. So there are no active launch facilities in Africa to date, even though Africa has some of the best launch geography in the world, particularly off the east coast of Africa. So Tanzania, Kenya, up to Somalia. These areas are equatorial, east coast facing, which is the ideal launch location. There isn't any launch yet. And so not only does this create questions around sovereign access to space, which is a separate but important element, there's also an opportunity from a purely commercial point of view to establish a highly cost competitive launch infrastructure that will be both commercially competitive, but also help to establish kind of significant development outcomes in terms of local industrialization and so on. So there's a lot of different ways in which these kinds of projects can kind of play a critical role, and where development banks can play a role in growing the space economy. But what are some of the kind of case studies that we know about? So there are sadly not that many case studies that we can talk about, in part because this shift towards a kind of new space environment in which this infrastructure is required has only emerged in the last few years. Certainly, in 2010, there just weren't that many satellites going up. So the need, for example, for ground infrastructure wasn't as high. When there were only, maybe a dozen satellites being launched every year, you didn't need as much tracking capability. Now we are launching, on the order of thousands of satellites per year. And so the need to sort of manage your space environment is much higher. So some of this is just because the industry doesn't require this. But also there's been a certain risk aversion towards these kinds of things. So the satellite that I showed earlier, the New Dawn satellite that AFTB invested into, was successfully placed into geostationary orbit, but unfortunately was unable to operate effectively because of a mechanical malfunction on the satellite. So that was effectively $25 million that was invested in that went nowhere. And so, this is from a bank point of view, even though development banks have a non-commercial mandate, they still operate on commercial terms, and they can't just, lose money constantly. So space has been a very, very high risk environment. And so, this kind of constrains the opportunities. But certainly, New Dawn was one example. The New Development Bank has recently looked at funding research projects, fostering innovation in kind of satellite technology at various Southern African universities. So there are some examples of this. I think we need to kind of promote this. One way of doing this is actually to look about this in the other direction, which is to say, what are the use cases for development banks to utilize space services? Because if we can convince the development banks of the value that they get from space-related programs, that will encourage, over time, the investment into this infrastructure. And this has kind of many applications. So, as I mentioned earlier, things like auditing of carbon trading, the kind of support for agriculture, like precision agriculture programs, remote monitoring of infrastructure, All of these things are enabled and can serve the development bank's kind of internal objectives and KPIs. It helps kind of inform their progress towards sustainable development goals. So this is an entire kind of data system that can help development banks to better achieve their objectives. And so if we start creating those kind of backward-looking case studies, this, I think, is a really important aspect for us to drive in order to, create interest from the development bank side. So just as I kind of start to wrap up, there are still a number of challenges that we need to think through in the African context, and in particular ways where generally speaking, many of our kind of country governments across the continent have limited financial resources. Much of the costs associated with space-related programs are in dollars, and I think many of us are conscious of the kind of foreign exchange challenges that exist. Whereas development banks, in many instances, are able to fund in local currency. This is an important kind of advantage, and acts as an additional mechanism to address these financial constraints. So this is an important element. There is a skills gap. The skills gap, in my view, is more of a challenge in the medium to long term. I think that we have plenty of people who are extremely capable of establishing the space sector, but when it grows, we are then unable to close that growth gap. And so thinking about how do we close that future gap is critical. There are infrastructure deficits, I've mentioned them before, and ensuring that infrastructure, the right data centers, this is something that will be critical for us to do over time. Of course, there are regulatory and political challenges. The establishment of the African space strategy and the African Space Agency will help to sort of go beyond that. But creating a single coherent view on space regulations across the continent will be kind of a really important element for us to think through. But all of these challenges are commercial opportunities, right? When I think about there aren't enough ground stations across Africa, that suggests to me that there's an opportunity to build them, right? So these are dual challenges and opportunities, all of which will ultimately yield the right kind of outcomes that we want, but also do need to be addressed. So maybe just as I kind of conclude, where do I think this is kind of going? Tim had mentioned earlier this report from the World Economic Forum showing that the space economy is expected to be on the order of $1.8 trillion by around 2035. In my view, that is an underestimation. We have seen a 99% drop in the cost to launch over the last 25 years. And any sector that shows a 99% change in costs undergoes unpredictable growth. And I think that we are at this point of unpredictability. So it will not surprise me if the space industry is significantly larger than that. And that means that there is a huge demand for satellite services, both on ground and on orbit. There's an enormous amount of innovation that's going to take place around this. There will be, in the same way that in 2000, when the internet really started emerging, no one knew at that point in time what a successful business model looks like in the internet world. In 2000, no one had a clue. We're at that same point today, that no one has won the new space race. And that gives us as Africans an opportunity to compete as effectively with everyone else globally. So, I think as we kind of build out our local infrastructure, as we utilize space to inform our kind of achievement of space of sustainable development goals, as we tap into the kind of young dynamic population, that we can train them properly, I think that we are extremely well positioned to be a real global leader in the industry. So, yeah, maybe just to conclude, I think that as the goal of development banks is to create these catalytic changes, I think that we're witnessing this change from the traditional to space 2.0, and in that moment of change, there's an opportunity for the development banks, but us also as kind of decision makers and leaders, to really shift the potential and shift the way that space touches each and every one of us. So I'm very happy to answer any questions, and yeah, I look forward to building a much closer relationship with the various development banks in the coming years, and with yourselves as graduates of this remarkable program.